Before we step back in time, take a moment to slow your breath. Wherever you are, lying in bed, resting in your favorite chair, or simply seeking a gentle distraction, allow your mind to settle. Let your thoughts drift softly like the desert winds that once blew across the banks of the Nile. This is Boring History for Sleep, where we explore the forgotten rhythms of life in distant centuries. If you enjoy this kind of peaceful storytelling, feel free to subscribe, but only if it feels right. I'd also love to know where and when you're listening. Are you winding down after a long day? Is the sun just setting where you are? Tonight's story will gently carry you to ancient Egypt, not to the towering pyramids or the glittering courts of the pharaohs, but into the quieter, more challenging corners of everyday life. We'll follow the thread of what it meant to be a woman during one of the most powerful civilizations in human history. From birth to old age, we'll uncover the burdens, expectations, and quiet resilience of Egyptian women who lived thousands of years ago, whose names may be forgotten, but whose lives echo in the traces they left behind. Dim the lights. Settle in. Let the past unfold gently before you. In the warm breath of the Nile Valley, where golden sands kissed narrow strips of green, life began not with fanfare, but with the quiet rituals of family and survival. The birth of a child in ancient Egypt was both an ordinary and sacred event, revered by tradition yet deeply shaped by the realities of class, health, and fate. For a girl, her very first breath was often accompanied by expectations that would follow her for the rest of her days. She was not just a daughter, but a future wife, worker, mother, and silent bearer of customs stretching back millennia. Childbirth itself was surrounded by a mixture of fear and spiritual preparation. In a world without modern medicine, giving birth was dangerous. Women labored on special bricks, birthing bricks, they were called, designed to elevate the mother during delivery. Midwives and older women from the village stood by her, offering support not only physically, but spiritually, calling on protective deities like Tauret, the hippo-headed goddess who watched over mothers and children. Despite these blessings, many births ended in tragedy, and infant mortality was heartbreakingly common. But when a baby girl survived, her family might give thanks with a quiet offering at a local shrine, and then quickly return to the rhythm of daily life. From her earliest years, a young girl learned that life would not be leisurely. In a farming village, she might follow her mother to the fields, helping with small chores like gathering reeds or collecting water in clay jars. In more urban settings, she might assist in grinding grain, weaving linen, or preparing food. Her world was filled with the sounds of tools, the fragrance of herbs, and the ever-present hum of duty. Her toys were often handmade, dolls carved from wood, or animals molded from clay. But even play was brief, for girlhood passed quickly, and her training for adult responsibilities began almost as soon as she could walk. Education, if it came at all, was minimal. Boys born into elite families might attend scribe schools, learning to write on smooth pieces of limestone with reed pens dipped in black or red ink. Girls, however, were rarely taught to read or write unless they belonged to the highest class. Instead, they learned the unspoken language of custom and obligation, how to knead bread, prepare beer, mix ointments, and keep a household running. Even religious rituals were often passed down from mother to daughter, carefully memorized chants and gestures performed before small statues in dusty corners of the home. Puberty marked a turning point. A girl's body began to change, and with it came new restrictions. She was taught modesty, not necessarily in dress. Egyptian clothing was often simple and revealing due to the hot climate, but in behavior. Respect for her father and later, her husband, became paramount. Her value was increasingly tied to her purity, her beauty, and her ability to bear children. The word of a father in this period was law. He would decide her future, and usually, her marriage. Marriages were often arranged while the girl was still in her early teens. The groom might be someone from the same village, a distant cousin, or even a widower needing help with his household. Love was not expected, though it sometimes bloomed later. What mattered more was the alliance between families, the promise of children, and the stability such a union could bring. There were no formal wedding ceremonies as we might imagine today. Rather, the woman simply moved into the house of her new husband, bringing with her a modest dowry of household items, perhaps a loom or a few jars of oil. In this new home, she would live under the eye of her husband's family. If she was lucky, her mother-in-law would be kind. But luck was fickle, and many young wives learned quickly that obedience and silence were the safest path. She worked from dawn until nightfall, grinding grain, baking bread, tending to animals, and bearing children one after the other. Pregnancy followed pregnancy, and with each one came the same risks her own mother had faced. The birthing bricks became all too familiar, and each time she knelt upon them, she knew there was a chance she might not rise again. Yet women were not entirely powerless. Within the home, they managed the household economy, keeping track of grain stores, managing servants if the family was wealthy enough, and maintaining religious traditions. Some women even ran small businesses out of their homes, brewing beer or making linen to sell in the marketplace. In the towns and cities of ancient Egypt, there are records of women acting as weavers, perfume makers, dancers, musicians, and even priestesses. These roles brought some autonomy, though always within the larger boundaries of what society allowed. Still, life for the majority was difficult. Food insecurity, illness, flooding of the Nile, and political shifts all weighed heavily on families, and women often bore the brunt of these hardships. If famine came, she was the one to go hungry first, feeding her children before herself. If war erupted nearby, it was her household that had to pick up the pieces. And through it all, she aged quickly, her face lined by the sun, her hands worn from labor, her body marked by years of childbearing and toil. When a woman died, her burial reflected her family's means. A wealthy woman might be buried with jars of perfume, finely woven linens, and amulets to protect her in the afterlife. A poor woman might receive only a simple grave, a few clay vessels, and whispered prayers. But all shared one hope, that their hardships in this life would be rewarded in the next. In the field of reeds, the ancient Egyptian paradise, she might finally find rest, surrounded by endless harvests, cool waters, and peace. Her story, though largely unwritten, remains in fragments, etched in tomb walls, recorded in faded scrolls, and buried in the rhythm of daily life by the Nile. It is the story of millions of women, whose labor upheld a civilization, even as their names faded into sand. As a girl crossed the uncertain threshold into womanhood, her place in ancient Egyptian society became both clearer and more constrained. The stages of her life were not hers to define. Rather, they were marked by duties prescribed by custom, reinforced by religion, and enforced by those around her. The Nile might have brought life to the land, but the waters did not carry with them freedom. For women, adulthood was often defined by what they could endure rather than what they could achieve. In ancient Egypt, a woman's value was intimately tied to her ability to bear children. Fertility was not just a personal matter, it was a family's future, a community's stability, and a cosmic responsibility in a society where everything, from the flooding of the Nile to the rising of the sun, was seen as part of divine order. A woman who bore many children was celebrated, especially if she gave birth to sons who could carry on the family name and inherit land or trade. But this celebration was often quiet and conditional. Her worth fluctuated with her womb, and complications in childbirth could swiftly turn praise into pity or blame. The danger of childbirth loomed heavily. Despite their spiritual preparations and traditional remedies, many women lost their lives in labor. Those who survived often carried physical burdens long after. Her back, her legs, her hips, every part of her bore the memory of those trials. And yet, even in these hardships, rest was rare. A new child meant new work, feeding, carrying, comforting, protecting. There was no nursery, no structured childcare, just the steady presence of the mother, folding her newborn into the rhythm of her endless responsibilities. Marriage, once seen as a marker of stability, could also become a source of vulnerability. The legal structure in ancient Egypt technically offered women more rights than in many later societies. They could own property, inherit land, and even initiate divorce. But in practice, those rights were often limited by class and circumstance. A wealthy woman might exercise some autonomy, but the majority of women, tied to farming families or humble tradespeople, had little power beyond what their husbands allowed. If he was kind, life could be bearable. If not, her world could shrink rapidly into silence and submission. Divorce, while possible, was not easily pursued by women. Leaving a husband meant leaving one's home, children, and community support. A woman would have to prove mistreatment or neglect, and even then, she risked becoming socially ostracized. Without a male protector, whether a father, brother, or son, her survival could become deeply uncertain. Widows faced a similar struggle. Some were taken in by extended family, others turned to temple service or small-scale business ventures to survive. But for many, the loss of a husband meant not only grief, but the collapse of her place in society. Religious belief offered both comfort and complexity. Women were active participants in daily worship, and goddesses played powerful roles in Egyptian mythology. Isis, the devoted wife and mother; Hathor, the nurturer and joy-bringer; Sekhmet, the fierce protector. These divine figures offered models of strength, care, and divine femininity. Yet these ideals also reinforced expectations. Women were meant to be like Isis, faithful, patient, endlessly devoted. To fall short of this model was not merely a personal failing, it was seen as an offense against cosmic balance. Rituals, especially those surrounding fertility and household harmony, were often performed by women. They knew which herbs to burn, which words to whisper, which charms to hang by the door to ward off illness or misfortune. In this way, women carried immense spiritual weight. If a child fell ill or a harvest failed, it was sometimes the mother who bore the blame, quietly accused of neglecting a ritual, angering a deity, or failing in unseen ways. These spiritual responsibilities were rarely recognized as authority. Rather, they were expected, invisible, and often burdensome. In wealthier households, women had servants or slaves to assist with chores, but this did not free them from responsibility. In fact, managing a household staff came with its own challenges, ensuring provisions were stocked, food prepared properly, children educated, and the home ready for guests or inspectors. These elite women were expected to be gracious hostesses, refined in speech and dress, knowledgeable about lineage and tradition. Their public image reflected on their husband's standing. A single social misstep could damage the family's honor. Outside the home, most women were rarely seen. The markets, riverbanks, and streets belonged primarily to men. However, there were exceptions. Some women, particularly those in artisan communities, worked openly alongside their husbands, painting tomb walls, crafting pottery, or brewing beer. These women sometimes managed accounts, negotiated with traders, and handed down skills to daughters. Yet even in these visible roles, they walked a careful line between respected worker and perceived impropriety. Gossip could be a quiet weapon, and reputations could falter quickly. Dress was simple, often a linen sheath dress tied at the shoulders, but even clothing spoke volumes. Cleanliness, subtle jewelry, braided hair, these were signs of discipline, modest pride, and femininity. The poorest women did their best with scraps, washing garments in the river, mending with reeds or rough thread. Perfume, made from myrrh or lotus oil, was a luxury few could afford, but even those who couldn't might tuck herbs into their robes for a touch of fragrance. Appearance, modest as it was, still mattered, for it told the world whether a woman was careful, respectable, and properly obedient to the rhythms of life. For the elderly, life could take two very different paths. Some older women gained respect as matriarchs, sought after for advice or healing knowledge. Others faded into the background, their bodies frail from decades of toil, their stories rarely written down or remembered. A woman who lived to see her grandchildren was considered fortunate, even honored. But she often did so with little comfort, her role shifting once again to help raise new children, cook, and care for others. True rest, if it came, was in the quiet moments at dusk, when the heat faded and she could sit beneath a shaded awning, the Nile reflecting a soft pink sky. Her life, from girlhood to old age, was not marked by loud declarations or monuments. It was measured in baskets of grain carried, children rocked to sleep, loaves of bread baked, prayers whispered to the household gods, and the silent endurance of countless daily tasks. Her resilience was not celebrated in grand temples, but it formed the very foundation of Egyptian society. In every home, behind every man whose name was carved into stone, there was a woman who carried the invisible weight of survival. Her life was difficult, yes, but in her own way, it was also profoundly meaningful. In the golden dust of early morning, before the markets filled and the river traffic stirred, young girls in ancient Egypt began their daily routines. While the image of the ancient world is often dominated by the towering figures of pharaohs and priests, the quiet persistence of women, especially young women, formed the heartbeat of daily life. From early girlhood, daughters were folded into the fabric of household duty and communal responsibility. Childhood was short, and while joy was not absent, it was tethered closely to obligation. Formal education in ancient Egypt was a privilege, and it was mostly reserved for boys, especially those born into wealthy families or priestly lineages. For girls, education took a different form: practical, domestic, and lifelong. Her instructors were her mother, grandmother, and elder sisters. In some rare cases, girls born to elite scribes or temple officials might be taught to read and write, but even then, their literacy was more often symbolic than applied. For most, learning meant memorizing how to grind grain, how to weave, how to treat a fever with crushed leaves, or how to interpret the rustle of reeds as a sign of changing weather. While boys practiced hieroglyphs on limestone fragments, girls were taught to knead dough until it no longer stuck to their fingers. They learned to sew linen tunics, to measure spices by handfuls rather than scales, to draw water without spilling from fragile clay jugs, and to recognize which oils calmed a cough. These were lessons written not in ink, but in action, transmitted through repetition, reinforced by necessity, and perfected in silence. Labor was the natural extension of this learning. In farming communities, girls accompanied their mothers to the fields to collect fallen grains or clean tools. In artisan households, they might sort raw materials, assist in dyeing cloth, or sweep the floors of workshops. In urban homes, they were tasked with fetching water, pounding herbs, or helping to mix mortar. These tasks were not viewed as chores in the modern sense, but as training, even a duty to one's household and ancestors. Girls often carried their younger siblings strapped to their backs or hips as they worked, gently rocking them with instinctive rhythm while sorting beans or brushing ashes from cooking stones. By the time they reached adolescence, many girls were not only caretakers but full contributors to the household economy. Their hands bore calluses, their shoulders carried weight, and their minds were shaped by the quiet discipline of consistency. For some, this discipline brought them into the orbit of skilled trades. A girl whose family worked with textiles might become an expert weaver, her hands dancing over the loom in a blur of thread. In perfume-making households, young women learned to press flower oils, mix resins, and stir heated mixtures with wooden paddles over open flames. Though such trades did not elevate them in the social hierarchy, they did offer a degree of pride, even artistry. And for those who excelled, this work could lead to small earnings or independence within their communities. Yet for most women, choices were limited. The structure of ancient Egyptian society was deeply stratified, not just by gender, but by class, occupation, and lineage. While men could pursue careers as scribes, soldiers, priests, or merchants, women were largely confined to roles within the home or trades passed down through female lines. Ambition was not forbidden, but it had little room to stretch. A girl might dream, but her dreams were hemmed in by walls built generations before her. Religious life offered a rare exception. Certain temples, especially those dedicated to female deities like Hathor and Isis, appointed women as chantresses, musicians, or even priestesses. These roles required training, poise, and often lineage. For a few fortunate girls, usually from noble families, this path allowed them a respected position in society, even some measure of autonomy. They performed rituals, led processions, and preserved sacred knowledge. But these positions were few, and for most girls, temple service was a distant possibility rather than a real aspiration. As adolescence turned into early adulthood, the pressure to marry grew stronger. While boys were encouraged to seek skills or prepare for inheritance, girls were prepared for union. Their behavior was more closely observed, their movements monitored, and their speech tempered. A girl's laughter might be considered too loud, her walk too free. Older women gently corrected her posture, her gaze, her responses, each adjustment shaping her into someone suitable for marriage. Once married, her labor continued without pause. The same skills she practiced as a daughter now became her daily rhythm as a wife. But where a girl could once lean on her mother or sisters, a young bride was often expected to prove her worth independently. She prepared meals for unfamiliar in-laws, cared for her husband's siblings or parents, and bore children of her own, sometimes within months of marriage. Motherhood was not a pause in her labor, it was an intensification. Infants required constant care, and without modern conveniences, every task, feeding, bathing, protecting, was done manually, repeatedly, and with care shaped by both love and necessity. There were no scheduled breaks, no formal rest. Yet, in the eyes of society, this was fulfillment. She was no longer just a daughter, she had become a vessel of lineage, a bearer of the future. For the few women who could not conceive, life was especially difficult. Though Egyptian society did not always blame women outright, the burden of infertility often fell on the wife's shoulders. Remedies were sought, herbs, amulets, prayers, but if these failed, she might face suspicion, whispers, or even rejection. Some husbands remarried or took another wife. Others maintained the household but turned emotionally distant. Either way, the woman's status became uncertain, her place no longer secure. Despite these challenges, women formed quiet networks of support. Neighbors, sisters, cousins, they leaned on each other with unspoken understanding. They helped with births, shared remedies, exchanged stories, and offered relief when someone was ill or overwhelmed. These bonds were not celebrated publicly, but they were essential for emotional survival. Even in a world that rarely offered comfort, women created it for one another. In their quiet strength, their precise hands, and their relentless endurance, daughters of the Nile carried more than their share. They carried baskets, water, children, and grief. They carried traditions and expectations, fears and faith. They carried the memory of their mothers, and the hope for their daughters. In them lived a form of resilience rarely recorded in scrolls or etched in stone, but one that shaped every generation that followed. The heart of ancient Egyptian society did not beat within the royal palace or the temple courtyard. It pulsed within the modest home, where women orchestrated the silent miracles of survival. To be a woman in this world was to become the architect of domestic life, not in theory, but in the persistent rhythm of motion. From dawn to nightfall, her hands shaped the day, her thoughts kept the household functioning, and her presence ensured the fragile order of daily life remained intact. The average Egyptian home was a small, mud-brick structure. In rural areas, these houses were often built directly against one another, forming compact neighborhoods with shared courtyards. Inside, rooms were simple and sparse. Some had only 1 or 2 chambers, with reed mats for sleeping, pottery for storage, and small altars for worship. Roofs were flat, sometimes used for sleeping during hot nights, and storage spaces were tucked beneath woven baskets, or in clay jars sealed against pests. There was no insulation from the seasons and no barriers against dust and sand, which meant cleanliness was a never-ending task. The woman of the house began her day before the first light crept over the horizon. While the rest of the household stirred slowly, she was already kneeling over grinding stones, transforming grains into flour. The grinding itself was physically exhausting, done by hand, in a kneeling position, with a heavy upper stone passed repeatedly over a lower slab. This task alone consumed several hours each day. It wore down not only the tools but the woman herself. Archaeologists have even found that the knees and backs of Egyptian women show clear signs of wear from years of grinding grain. Deep grooves in bones, worn joints, and muscular strain left their mark long after death. But flour was only the beginning. With it came dough, then baking, usually on open clay ovens heated by charcoal or dried dung. The smoke choked the air, blackened the walls, and left a residue in the lungs that never quite faded. Bread was a daily staple, and its production was a daily necessity. Alongside bread came beer, the other vital element of the Egyptian diet. Women brewed beer in large ceramic jars, mixing partially baked bread with water and fermenting it under the sun. The result was a thick, yeasty beverage full of calories and nutrients, a meal in itself. Cooking, while central, was far from the only demand. There were clothes to wash, water to carry, children to feed, livestock to tend, and tools to repair. Linen, the primary fabric in ancient Egypt, had to be soaked, scrubbed, and beaten clean on stone slabs. Water, drawn from the Nile or public wells, was carried in large jugs balanced on shoulders or heads. Even gathering water was not a quick chore. It involved a walk, sometimes long, with heavy loads, repeated multiple times each day. Children, especially the youngest, were rarely out of their mother's sight. Infants were carried in slings, soothed with gentle songs and fragrant oils. Older children helped with chores but still required supervision. Feeding the family, managing their clothing, maintaining religious rituals, and keeping insects and disease at bay, all of these responsibilities fell squarely on the shoulders of women. Their labor was expected, unseen, and relentless. Despite these demands, the home was more than just a space of labor. It was also a sacred place. Ancient Egyptians saw the household as a microcosm of the universe, and women were its quiet priests. At small household shrines, they lit incense, offered bread and beer, and whispered prayers to protective deities. Tauret guarded pregnancies. Bes, the dwarf-like god, protected families from evil. Hathor brought music and joy. These acts of devotion were simple, but deeply meaningful. A woman's faith was both private and constant, woven into the same hands that stirred dough and braided hair. Some women possessed amulets or papyrus scrolls with protective spells. These were not for grand ceremonies but for daily fears, sickness, poor harvests, fevers in children, bites from snakes. They spoke these spells quietly, believing that divine power could flow through words, even whispered ones. Knowledge of healing herbs, birth rituals, and spiritual protection was passed down not in scrolls but through generations of women who knew how to mend not just bodies, but homes. For women of slightly higher status, wives of artisans, scribes, or merchants, the household could also become a space of economic activity. Some sold baked goods, cloth, pottery, or small cosmetics like scented oils. These women managed production, stored goods, and handled trade within a female-centered network. The markets were often overseen by men, but many transactions began in the hands of women who provided the products in the first place. A woman who made perfume or jewelry could quietly build a reputation for quality, and though she might not be famous, her name would be known among neighbors and midwives. Even more than these small businesses, though, it was the invisible work that defined a woman's role. She noticed when a neighbor had too little grain and offered a share. She taught her daughter how to mend a broken jug with clay and ash. She remembered which herbs helped calm a fever and when to boil water instead of using it cold. Her intelligence was not measured by ink but by insight, pattern recognition, emotional awareness, and adaptability. She could look at the sky and feel a storm coming, glance at a child and sense a coming illness, or hear the silence of her husband's footsteps and know the mood he carried. Though patriarchal structure dominated Egyptian society, women's authority within the home was rarely questioned. She managed resources, children, guests, and even religious observance. A wise mother was revered, and a capable wife praised in quiet, consistent ways. Proverbs from ancient texts show respect for the housewife who is watchful of her home, who nourishes her children, and who keeps peace in her house. These were not empty phrases. They were reflections of a cultural truth. Without the woman, the home would fall. Illness in a mother was a quiet crisis. When she fell sick, the entire rhythm of the household staggered. Meals were late, laundry unfinished, the atmosphere heavy. Even her silence echoed. In such times, daughters stepped in, taking up her tools with trembling hands, learning what their futures would demand. Recovery brought gratitude, but also a deeper awareness that this role, this relentless labor, would soon be theirs to carry fully. Seasons shifted. Floodwaters rose and receded. Children grew, elders passed, but the home persisted. A woman's presence was constant, woven into the walls, felt in the air, etched into the habits of those she fed, healed, and taught. She might not be named in records or praised in papyri, but her life was the essential foundation of civilization. In the grand temples, men honored gods with gold and granite. But in the modest homes of Egypt, women honored the divine with bread, with warmth, with steadiness. Their offerings were not measured in treasure but in time, day after day, year after year, given in quiet devotion to the household, to the future, and to the fragile beauty of life itself. Within the stone walls of modest homes and sun-baked village courtyards, ancient Egyptian women lived their lives not only through labor and devotion but also through the physical burdens their bodies carried. Health, in this era, was a fragile and unpredictable companion, always in question, rarely in abundance. To be a woman in this world meant to understand pain not as an interruption, but as a constant rhythm, manageable on good days, overwhelming on others, but never far from daily life. The human body, especially the female body, was both a vessel of life and a site of struggle. Women's health was deeply intertwined with their social roles. From puberty to old age, their bodies were expected to be strong, fertile, capable of working long hours, and above all, able to bear children. Fertility was seen as a woman's greatest asset, but it also became her greatest trial. Childbirth in ancient Egypt was an act of courage repeated countless times. Without modern sanitation, surgical tools, or knowledge of infection, every pregnancy carried the risk of loss, for the mother, the child, or both. And yet, childbearing was not rare or spaced out over many years. Women had multiple pregnancies throughout their lives, often with little time to recover between them. When labor began, the woman was often surrounded by other women, her mother, sisters, midwives, or neighbors, who helped guide her through the birth. She would squat on birthing bricks, designed to keep her upright and to allow gravity to aid the process. These bricks were decorated with protective symbols and goddesses to ward off danger, yet spiritual comfort could only do so much. Pain relief was minimal. Some women chewed on herbs known to dull discomfort, others relied on massage or the comforting chants of women around them. If the birth was successful, the mother was considered blessed, though there was little time for rest. She still had to nurse the infant, tend to her household, and recover while continuing her daily labor. If complications arose, excessive bleeding, infections, or retained placenta, there was no doctor to call. Healing, if it came, relied on natural remedies, divine intervention, or sheer resilience. Breastfeeding was essential in a world without formula or substitutes. Mothers nursed their children for several years, and weaning was a gradual process. If a woman could not produce enough milk, a wet nurse might be sought, but only in wealthier families. For the poor, this lack could be tragic. Children were particularly vulnerable in their first years, and disease spread easily. Diarrhea, fevers, and infections claimed countless young lives. The grief of losing a child was common, though rarely recorded in official texts. But in quiet tomb inscriptions and in the weary expressions of statues, that sorrow remains, etched into history through silence. Beyond childbirth, women faced a range of health challenges. Their bodies bore the strain of physical labor, grinding grain, carrying water, scrubbing laundry, and tending crops. These tasks were not light, and years of repetitive motion left their mark. Their joints ached, muscles stiffened, and backs curved from bending too long in the fields or at the hearth. There were no clinics or structured medical practices for pain relief, only poultices, massages, and knowledge passed down through generations. A heated brick might be placed on sore muscles, or a salve of honey and herbs applied to a cut or rash. Illness, too, was a constant threat. Insects carried disease, water sometimes contained harmful bacteria, and food could spoil in the intense heat. Parasites were common, and skin infections spread easily. A simple scratch could become dangerous if it became inflamed. Fevers were especially feared, as they often signaled deeper illness. Women were usually the first to notice these signs in their children or themselves, and their response depended on home remedies and prayer. The medical knowledge women carried was practical and deeply rooted in tradition. They knew which plants helped reduce inflammation, which resin soothed the stomach, and which oils prevented insect bites. This knowledge was learned informally, passed from grandmother to mother to daughter. In many homes, the mother was the household healer. She was not a physician in the formal sense, but she held the responsibility for health, which was viewed as both a physical and spiritual condition. Spiritual health was seen as deeply linked to physical well-being. If someone fell ill, it was often believed that they had offended a god or failed to uphold a ritual. In such cases, women were often the ones to perform purification rituals, burn incense, or offer food and drink to household gods. Certain amulets were believed to have protective power, and some women wore them daily for years. They were strung on leather or linen cords and tucked close to the skin, tiny shields against misfortune. When illness became too severe to handle at home, families might turn to a local healer, usually a man trained in traditional medicine, but sometimes a woman known for her healing gifts. These healers used a blend of herbal treatments, incantations, and rudimentary surgeries. The most common prescriptions included honey for wounds, garlic for infections, and dates for digestive issues. Papyrus scrolls like the Ebers Papyrus recorded some of these practices, but most remedies lived only in memory, passed orally in kitchens and courtyards. Menstrual health was another quiet burden. Women experienced their cycles with little support or comfort. Sanitary materials were likely made from folded linen or softened papyrus, and there is some evidence that women stayed near the home during their cycles. Though menstruation was a natural part of life, it was sometimes viewed with discomfort or even suspicion, particularly in religious contexts. Women were often restricted from temple service during this time, and certain rituals were avoided until they had purified themselves. Age came quickly for Egyptian women. By modern standards, life expectancy was low, and women who survived past their childbearing years bore the physical consequences of decades of labor and hardship. Teeth worn down from eating coarse bread, joints damaged from grinding and lifting, skin weathered by sun and wind. Yet, there was a quiet respect afforded to elder women, especially those who had seen multiple generations grow. They became storytellers, advisors, and carriers of wisdom. Their words, though rarely written down, shaped the behaviors and beliefs of their families. There was no concept of retirement, no period of restful withdrawal. Women worked until they no longer could, then continued in smaller ways, minding children, preparing herbs, or teaching younger women the traditions they had learned in youth. Their legacy was not measured in monuments, but in the continuation of knowledge, rituals, and the survival of the household. In Tomb art, we see women seated beside their husbands, offering flowers to the gods, or playing instruments at feasts. But the real picture is more complex. Their lives were lived behind the scenes, in kitchens, gardens, workshops, and quiet corners where grief, laughter, fear, and hope unfolded daily. Their health was not often recorded in scrolls, but their pain, endurance, and healing formed the hidden backbone of Egyptian society. Even as their bodies bent under the weight of their responsibilities, their spirits remained remarkably resilient. They did not seek praise, they sought peace, safety, and continuity. And in the quiet spaces of their homes, they found small moments of grace, watching a child sleep, hearing the breeze through a reed window, or sharing a rare moment of stillness at the close of a long day. In the grand temples of ancient Egypt, where statues of gods towered over rows of lotus-shaped columns, rituals were performed with precise choreography, and sacred vows echoed under stone ceilings. But far from these sacred halls, the ritual that shaped the lives of most women, marriage, unfolded without formal ceremony or public blessing. There were no wedding gowns, no exchange of rings, and no officiant declaring a couple as one. Instead, marriage in ancient Egypt was often marked by a simple act: a woman moving into a man's household, her belongings bundled in linen, her status transformed not by law or celebration, but by assumption. This understated transition was not without importance. Though it lacked ceremony, marriage carried profound meaning for the individuals involved, especially for women, who would find their entire lives reoriented overnight. The decision to marry was typically made by the father, sometimes in consultation with the mother, and almost always shaped by practical concerns. Affection, while not absent, was secondary to social alliances, household needs, and family stability. A man might seek a wife to help manage his home, bear his children, or solidify ties with another family. A woman, in turn, was expected to bring industriousness, modesty, and fertility. The process was rarely romanticized. A girl might be promised in marriage while still in her early teens, particularly in agricultural or artisan communities where early unions ensured continuity of labor and lineage. The age of the husband often varied widely. In some cases, he might be only a few years older. In others, he might be middle-aged, a widower seeking a new partner to care for his children or manage his affairs. A widow or divorced woman might also remarry, though this was more common among those of means who could support themselves in the interim. Dowries were a key component of the marital arrangement. These were not grand fortunes, but modest offerings, pots, tools, linens, oils, and perhaps some livestock, meant to support the new household. The husband, for his part, was expected to provide a bride price or marriage gift. This might include jewelry, land rights, or labor commitments. These exchanges were not merely symbolic. They represented a redistribution of resources and responsibilities, reflecting the blending of two lives into one shared domestic economy. Upon entering her husband's home, a woman stepped into a role that was already defined for her. She was now responsible for the smooth functioning of a new household, often under the watchful eyes of in-laws. In many cases, the home was multigenerational, with elderly parents, unmarried siblings, or even other wives living under the same roof. This required careful navigation of social dynamics. A young wife who demonstrated respect, skill, and obedience might earn favor. One who challenged hierarchy or failed to meet expectations might find herself isolated or quietly rebuked. Despite these pressures, the marital relationship itself could range from transactional to affectionate. Ancient Egyptian art and writing contained glimpses of tender partnerships. In tomb inscriptions, husbands praised their wives as mistress of the house, or beloved of my heart. Some poems speak of longing and joy between spouses, of shared laughter and quiet understanding. While many marriages began as arrangements, some grew into genuine companionship over time. A wife's duties extended far beyond keeping the home clean. She was expected to bear children, instruct servants or younger relatives, manage food stores, and ensure the home's religious rituals were maintained. She might also play a role in her husband's business, especially if he was a craftsman or trader. Women in these households sometimes managed sales, maintained inventory, or negotiated with customers, particularly other women. In rural areas, a wife might help in the fields, planting, harvesting, or gathering herbs used in medicine or ritual. Though the law allowed women to own property, sign contracts, and even divorce their husbands, the reality was more complicated. Legal documents were accessible primarily to those who were literate and had the means to pursue formal proceedings. For most women, especially in lower social classes, the exercise of these rights depended on their relationships with male relatives. A woman without a father, brother, or grown son to advocate for her found herself in a precarious position. Even her own possessions could be claimed or controlled by her husband if social norms allowed. Divorce, while legal, carried social consequences. A woman who left her husband might return to her family, but she risked being viewed as disobedient or undesirable. If she had children, custody was typically shared or granted to the father. In rare cases, women initiated divorce due to neglect or mistreatment, but the process required courage and support. Most endured their marriages, finding ways to navigate the challenges and assert small measures of independence where they could. Infidelity was frowned upon, though more harshly for women than for men. A woman suspected of straying risked public shame and possible expulsion from the home. Men were sometimes permitted to take secondary wives or concubines, though this was more common among the elite. For a woman, fidelity was not just a moral expectation but a protective strategy. Her honor, and often her safety, depended on it. Within the marriage, power dynamics varied. Some wives wielded quiet influence over their husbands, offering counsel or guiding decisions behind closed doors. Others differed publicly but found autonomy in managing household affairs. In rare cases, particularly in elite families, a wife might act as the public face of the household when her husband was away, negotiating contracts or maintaining business ties. But such autonomy was the exception, not the rule. Children cemented a woman's place in the household. With each birth, her value increased. Sons, in particular, strengthened her position, as they ensured the continuation of the family line and offered future protection. Daughters, while welcomed, were often seen as future assets to be married into other families. A woman who bore many children was respected, but also burdened. Her body became a site of constant demand, and her time was stretched between tending to infants, managing the home, and preparing for the next pregnancy. Yet within these challenges, women created moments of joy. They celebrated milestones quietly: a child's first steps, a successful harvest, a rare afternoon of song or storytelling. They found humor in daily tasks, friendship in neighboring wives, and comfort in their faith. Even without grand ceremonies, anniversaries, or tokens of romance, many couples grew together in shared purpose, their bond shaped by the demands and rhythms of daily life. And when a woman grew older, her role shifted once again. She became a mother-in-law, a matron, a keeper of family memory. Younger women sought her advice, and her grandchildren sat at her feet. Her marriage, once a threshold, became the foundation of generations. And though no priest had officiated her union, no festival had marked her wedding day, she had fulfilled her role with quiet dignity. Marriage in ancient Egypt was not defined by pageantry. It was defined by endurance, adaptation, and shared labor. It was a partnership shaped not by vows, but by the long, slow weaving of two lives into one, a weaving done not with thread, but with patience, resilience, and the unspoken hope that life, though difficult, could still be meaningful when lived together. In ancient Egypt, motherhood was not simply a chapter in a woman's life, it was often its very center. From the moment a young bride first suspected she might be with child, the weight of expectation settled over her. To bear children was to fulfill a divine duty, a societal role, and a family obligation all at once. Yet motherhood, while revered in concept, was rarely easy in practice. It was a path lined with risk, toil, and an unspoken acceptance of loss. And still, countless women walked it, again and again, anchored by tradition, hope, and the quiet persistence that defined their lives. Pregnancy was both a blessing and a burden. Without the benefit of prenatal care or reliable medical knowledge, the signs of pregnancy were interpreted through experience and ritual. A missed cycle, changes in appetite, or unusual dreams might be seen as indicators. Women might turn to old remedies or spiritual tests, like placing barley and wheat in cloths soaked with a woman's urine to see which sprouted first, a rudimentary attempt at early pregnancy testing. These folk practices were not seen as superstition, but as inherited wisdom, passed down through generations of mothers and midwives who had little else to rely on. As a pregnancy progressed, women adjusted their work but rarely ceased it. Even in the later months, expectant mothers ground grain, fetched water, and tended fires. If they were fortunate, other women in the household took on heavier tasks, but in most homes, labor was simply shared differently, not reduced. The idea of resting during pregnancy was virtually unknown for the majority. Instead, daily life continued, shaped around the changing body and the emotional undercurrent of anticipation, fear, and resolve. When labor came, it did so without warning and often without pause in the routine. Women gave birth in the home, surrounded by female kin and midwives. There were no sterile instruments or clean hospital beds, just birthing bricks, damp cloths, herbal poultices, and the practiced hands of those who had seen many births before. The birthing position was upright, aided by gravity, and often accompanied by chants, incantations, or offerings to gods like Tauret and Bes, divine protectors of mothers and infants. The room might be darkened, the air thick with incense, the tension as ancient as the land itself. And yet, despite these preparations, childbirth was treacherous. Complications such as breech births, hemorrhaging, or infections could arise quickly. Without tools to intervene, a birth that began with hope could end in mourning. Infant mortality was high, and maternal mortality not uncommon. When a child was stillborn, or a mother did not survive the ordeal, grief hung heavy in the air, rarely written down, but deeply felt in the walls of each home where it occurred. When both mother and child survived, the newborn was immediately wrapped in linen and nursed at the breast. Breastfeeding was not merely nourishment, it was life. Infants were swaddled and carried close to the body, skin to skin, tied with linen or held in soft slings that allowed the mother to continue her work. Crying infants were soothed with gentle rocking, humming, or the scent of lotus oil. The mother's hands were always busy, but her presence was constant. There were no separate nurseries or caretakers. Children were raised in the same spaces where meals were cooked, grain was ground, and prayers were spoken. As children grew, mothers bore responsibility for their early education. Boys and girls alike learned from their mothers first, how to walk, how to speak, how to hold a bowl or use a small broom. Moral lessons were taught through story and example, often rooted in the family's traditions and beliefs. Respect, obedience, modesty, and devotion were instilled early, not through punishment but through repetition and the silent power of example. Mothers watched their children closely, seeing in their behaviors the first signs of future character. Illness, however, was never far away. In the heat of summer or the dampness after flooding, children were vulnerable to disease. Fevers, stomach ailments, coughs, and infections spread easily, and without modern medicine, many ailments proved fatal. Mothers did what they could with what they had: herbal teas, poultices, amulets, and prayers. But even their most attentive efforts could not always prevent loss. The death of a child was not rare, and yet each loss was deeply personal. Tomb paintings, though often idealized, sometimes depict mothers holding children close, expressions tender and protective, a glimpse of a love that persisted even in the face of grief. Despite these sorrows, children were also a source of immense joy. Their laughter, their first words, their games played with pebbles and clay toys. These moments offered a balm against the harshness of life. Mothers took pride in watching their sons grow strong and their daughters mirror their skills. Children were not burdens, they were the future, the hope, the reason to continue. They brought renewal to homes weathered by toil, and became the threads that connected past generations to the promise of new ones. Motherhood also shaped a woman's status in her household. A mother of several children, especially sons, gained respect from her in-laws and neighbors. Her opinion might be sought more often, her presence quietly acknowledged with reverence. Elder women who had raised many children were seen as sources of wisdom, midwives, healers, storytellers, and advisors. Even in a society where women held limited public power, motherhood granted a form of quiet authority that extended across generations. Yet, this power came at a cost. The repeated cycle of pregnancy, childbirth, nursing, and childrearing took a toll. By the time a woman reached her 30s or 40s, her body often bore the marks of these experiences. Muscle fatigue, back pain, dental wear from poor nutrition, and chronic exhaustion were common. And still, the responsibilities did not end. Older children required guidance, marriages needed arranging, grandchildren were born. The work shifted, but it never truly stopped. Even in death, a mother's role was honored with simplicity. A small offering left at her tomb, a whispered prayer from a grown child, or a carved inscription thanking her for her care. Few women were given large funerals or monumental tombs. Most were buried with modest objects: combs, mirrors, jewelry, a loaf of bread, perhaps a handprint left by a child. But in these humble tokens lay the true measure of her legacy. She had given life, shaped it, and sustained it with her hands, her heart, and her unyielding perseverance. She had endured pain without complaint, loss without bitterness, and endless labor without recognition. And in doing so, she had held together the very structure of society, one generation at a time. The story of motherhood in ancient Egypt is not one of glory or spectacle. It is a story of quiet strength, of daily acts of care that carried more weight than stone columns or royal decrees. It is a story written not in hieroglyphs, but in lullabies, whispered names, and the soft imprint of hands that shaped the future, patiently, lovingly, and without end. Before a girl in ancient Egypt could become a wife, a mother, or the manager of a household, she spent her early years absorbing the world around her with wide eyes and quiet obedience. While childhood today might be marked by freedom and play, the childhood of a girl along the Nile was often short, shaped more by responsibility than leisure. From her first steps, she was being prepared, not always by direct instruction, but by the rhythms of her mother's daily life, the expectations of her father's voice, and the silent lessons embedded in each gesture, chore, and glance exchanged between women. A girl's early life began with the home as her universe. Unlike boys, who might venture out to apprentice in trades or learn the script of scribes if they were fortunate, girls remained largely within the walls of the house or the narrow paths of the village. Their tasks were modest at first, handing tools to their mothers, helping stir porridge, sweeping courtyards with palm brooms, or fetching small bundles of kindling for the morning fire. But even these tiny tasks were early steps in a lifelong pattern of labor and devotion. Play, while present, was rarely separate from work. Dolls were shaped from clay or linen scraps, their features painted with coal or ochre. Little girls might mimic the movements of their mothers, rocking small bundles as though they were infants, or pretending to grind grain with pebbles and tiny stones. Games involving pebbles, hoops, or animal bones provided brief distraction, but they were often played while watching over younger siblings or waiting for instructions. Laughter was not forbidden, but it existed within a framework of duty, always aware of time, elders, and the larger rhythm of the household. The girls of ancient Egypt were not taught their roles through formal education. Instead, they learned by imitation and immersion. Watching their mothers and older sisters, they internalized a vast repertoire of skills: kneading dough, shaping clay, mixing oils, and folding cloth. These were not optional talents. They were survival tools, necessary for running a home, raising children, and becoming worthy in the eyes of future in-laws. A girl's intelligence was measured not in letters or numbers, but in how well she managed a task, how quickly she remembered a recipe, how quietly she obeyed when spoken to. As she approached adolescence, a girl's awareness of her own body and its future role began to grow. Conversations around her shifted. She was warned against wandering too far, against speaking too freely, against behaviors that might damage her reputation. Modesty became more emphasized, not necessarily in clothing, which remained simple due to the heat, but in posture, tone, and movement. Her presence was meant to be helpful, respectful, and increasingly reserved. The older women began to include her in more adult tasks, learning to braid hair in ceremonial styles, measuring herbs for medicine, or preparing offerings for household gods. Puberty marked a distinct turning point. Her changing body became both a symbol of fertility and a source of caution. Women around her began preparing her, often subtly, for the possibility of marriage. Marriage could occur soon after her first cycle, and she understood that her path forward would not be hers alone to choose. Fathers arranged unions based on economic or social considerations, and daughters were expected to accept their match without protest. The home she had known might soon no longer be hers. Her mother's warm voice, her familiar sleeping mat, even her neighbors, these could all change overnight. Despite the weight of these expectations, many young girls displayed remarkable adaptability. They folded themselves into new households, new roles, new families, and learned again how to serve, how to bear, and how to endure. But for the girl still in her father's home, the final years before marriage were a bittersweet period of transition. She was no longer a child, but not yet fully grown. Her responsibilities grew heavier, yet she had little authority. She helped discipline younger siblings, but still deferred to older women. She worked harder each day, and yet remained uncertain of what her life would soon become. Among wealthier families, the path could differ slightly. Daughters of nobles, priests, or merchants might receive some formal education, learning to read or manage household accounts. They might be taught how to recite hymns, prepare ritual offerings, or participate in family ceremonies. Their marriages were often arranged with more ceremony, and their dowries were more substantial. Yet even these privileges came with pressure, expectations of grace, intelligence, fertility, and perfect decorum. A girl raised in luxury was still expected to bear children, manage servants, and represent her family with honor. For poorer girls, there was little pretense. Their labor was required at every stage, and their transitions into marriage and motherhood were swift. Some were married before their voices had deepened into adult tones. Others remained with their families longer, assisting with siblings or the sick. In some cases, girls whose parents died early might live with aunts or older sisters, becoming folded into new households as semi-daughters, semi-servants. In all cases, their paths were shaped more by duty than desire. Yet even within these boundaries, girls found ways to assert themselves. They shared jokes with other children, learned songs from elders, and whispered stories under the stars. They developed preferences for certain colors, certain herbs, certain prayers. They noticed the world keenly, picking up the rhythms of the river, the moods of their elders, and the subtle hierarchies of village life. They carried memories of their mother's hands, their father's faces, and the feel of warm mud beneath bare feet. These memories, though quiet, formed the foundation of who they became. In time, the girl would rise before dawn, as her mother had, to grind grain and knead dough. She would braid her child's hair, light incense at the household altar, and listen for the soft splash of the Nile outside her home. And in these moments she would remember the small joys and silent lessons of her own girlhood, woven tightly into the fabric of who she was. The life of a girl in ancient Egypt was never truly her own, at least not in the way we think of individuality today. But within the patterns of duty and tradition, she created identity. She became a part of something larger, a family, a lineage, a civilization built on continuity. And though her name may not have been carved in stone, her life mattered. She carried the future, quietly and carefully, from one generation to the next. While the image of ancient Egyptian women is often framed within the domestic sphere, grinding grain, nursing children, or performing rituals in the home, the reality for many was far broader. In villages pressed between the desert and the Nile, and in the bustling markets of towns and cities, women were not passive observers of public life. They were active participants, vital contributors to the economy, and the often invisible labor force behind Egypt's enduring strength. To be a woman was not to be idle. It was to work constantly, often in places and ways rarely recognized by formal history. The rural economy of ancient Egypt depended heavily on agriculture, and while men often took the lead in plowing, irrigation, and herding, women's labor was just as essential. During harvest season, especially, women joined the men in the fields. They helped gather crops by hand, stooping under the sun to pluck grain, vegetables, and reeds. Their baskets, woven from palm fronds or grasses, quickly filled with onions, garlic, lettuce, barley, and emmer wheat. This work was physically demanding and often done in long shifts, broken only by quick meals or brief shelter under trees or simple woven canopies. Children were often close by, sometimes working, sometimes playing in the shade of the date palms. Mothers watched over them while rhythmically bending and lifting, their movements practiced and efficient. In some regions, women tended small gardens near their homes, cultivating herbs, legumes, or melons. These small plots fed their families and sometimes provided enough surplus to trade or sell. Though modest in scale, they were critical in times of poor harvests or when floodwaters failed to rise high enough to irrigate distant fields. Animal care was another domain where women contributed daily. Goats, chickens, ducks, and cows needed feeding, cleaning, and constant monitoring. Women milked goats and cows, made cheese, collected eggs, and ensured pens and enclosures were maintained. These tasks, while repetitive, were vital to sustaining both diet and trade. In some communities, women oversaw the breeding of animals, selecting which animals to pair and keeping informal records of health and productivity passed down through oral tradition. Beyond the fields and homes, women played an active role in the markets. While formal trade and long-distance commerce were often male-dominated, local markets were more fluid. Women brought their homemade goods to barter or sell: baskets of bread, jars of beer, bunches of herbs, cloth, fish, perfumes, or pots of honey. Some sold cosmetics made from ochre and oil, others offered incense blends or amulets shaped by local artisans. These stalls were humble, often just mats on the ground or baskets propped open, but they were vibrant centers of commerce, conversation, and community. Older women sometimes took the lead in these exchanges, using their experience and familiarity with neighbors to negotiate better prices. Younger women watched and learned, slowly gaining confidence and presence. In busy areas, girls accompanied their mothers, holding the ends of baskets, arranging goods for display, and listening carefully to the rhythm of trade. These outings were more than errands. They were lessons in value, trust, and self-presentation. Craft production was another area where women quietly contributed. In homes or small workshops, they spun linen from flax, wove textiles, and embroidered garments. Some made pottery, molded figurines, or carved small household items. These goods could be used within the family or sold to supplement household income. While these women rarely held formal titles, their work helped sustain artisan families and filled the markets with goods both practical and beautiful. A few exceptional women even managed small enterprises. In records preserved from Deir el-Medina, a village of skilled workers who built royal tombs, women are noted as owning property, lending money, and operating businesses. Some hired workers, kept records, and negotiated contracts, especially when their husbands were absent. These women, while not common, reveal a level of autonomy and financial literacy that challenges simple notions of women's roles. Temples also provided opportunities for certain women to work, though these were largely reserved for the elite. Women could serve as musicians, dancers, or chantresses, performing sacred roles during religious festivals or in daily temple rituals. These roles required discipline, training, and often lineage. In the case of temple musicians, women learned complex rhythms and chants, rehearsed for processions, and participated in performances intended to honor the gods. Though their service was religious, it was also labor, and it demanded both skill and devotion. In poorer households, women sometimes worked in the homes of wealthier families. These women might be hired to help with cooking, laundry, or child-rearing. Others became wet nurses, caring for infants when upper-class women were unable or unwilling to nurse their own. While these positions offered income and access to elite households, they also placed women in vulnerable positions, subject to the expectations, moods, and whims of their employers. Enslaved women, too, formed a part of this laboring class, though their experiences were far more restricted. They performed grueling tasks with little autonomy, and their lives were shaped by the control of others. Still, even within these difficult circumstances, they learned skills, formed bonds, and participated in the daily rhythms of the households they served. Work for women in ancient Egypt was constant, varied, and rarely acknowledged in written records. There were no formal professions or guilds dedicated to their trades, no official recognition of their labor in the way scribes or builders were honored. Yet their contributions were undeniable. They kept markets flowing, homes running, children fed, and crops harvested. Without their hands, the structure of daily life would have faltered. In tomb scenes and wall paintings, we sometimes catch a glimpse of them: a woman kneeling over a loom, another pouring beer into a jar, another selling onions to a passing customer. These images, while small and often pushed to the edges of grander displays, are windows into a truth more powerful than any royal decree, that the survival and success of ancient Egypt depended not only on kings and priests, but on the tireless labor of ordinary women. Their work was not glamorous. It did not lead to fame or statues, but it fed the people, clothed the families, and sustained the world around them. These invisible workers were, in truth, the backbone of a civilization. And though their names may be lost, the echoes of their footsteps remain, in every marketplace stone, every worn field path, and every thread of linen that once passed through their hands. In a world where the divine touched every aspect of life, from the rhythm of the Nile's floods to the birth of a child, religion was not a distant or abstract concept. It was lived, breathed, and practiced daily. For women in ancient Egypt, spirituality was woven into the very fabric of their existence. Though the grand temples were largely dominated by male priests and scribes, women held essential and nuanced roles in both household worship and formal religious life. These roles, though often less visible in historical records, were deeply influential. Through their rituals, songs, prayers, and offerings, women became stewards of spiritual continuity, quietly linking their families and communities to the gods. Religious belief in ancient Egypt was expansive and deeply personal. Gods and goddesses governed every aspect of life: fertility, harvests, love, protection, and death. The pantheon included male deities like Ra, Osiris, and Ammonius, but also powerful female figures such as Isis, Hathor, Nephthys, and Batet. These goddesses were not mere companions to male gods. They embodied creation, protection, healing, and resurrection. Women identified with them not only in ritual but in daily life, modeling themselves after their virtues and calling upon them for support during hardship. At the center of most homes stood a small shrine or altar, a sacred space carved into the wall or built from stone or wood. Here, women performed daily acts of devotion. They lit oil lamps, offered bread or fruit, burned incense made from frankincense or myrrh, and poured water from polished vessels. These offerings were often modest but heartfelt, a symbol of gratitude, a request for protection, or a gesture to maintain harmony within the household. These acts, repeated day after day, were never recorded in temple logs, but they were the spiritual heartbeat of ordinary life. Women led these rituals in the home. They taught their daughters how to prepare offerings, how to chant the names of the gods, and how to recognize sacred symbols. They anointed statues of deities with scented oil, cleaned the altar, and whispered prayers for health, safety, and fertility. Even in times of personal grief or sickness, the ritual continued, for it was believed that a household out of harmony with the gods would fall into misfortune. This sense of sacred duty gave women quiet authority within their domestic realm. In addition to home rituals, certain women participated in formal religious roles. These positions were mostly accessible to those of high birth, but they provided a rare avenue for female visibility and influence. One of the most prestigious roles was that of the chantress of Ammonius, a temple musician and singer who participated in daily rituals and ceremonial processions. These women were trained in hymnody, instrumental music, and sacred recitations. They were expected to remain ritually pure, follow strict routines, and devote their lives to the service of the gods. Chantresses wore elaborately pleated linen gowns and adorned themselves with jewelry symbolic of divine favor, amulets shaped like the eye of Horus or the Ankh, necklaces of gold and turquoise, and lotus-shaped headdresses. Their voices filled the great halls of the temple, offering songs to soothe the gods and maintain the balance of Ma'at, the sacred order of the universe. While male priests conducted sacrifices and read from sacred texts, the music and chants of these women were believed to awaken divine presence and open the channels between the heavens and the earthly realm. Other women served as dancers, particularly in festivals honoring Hathor, goddess of joy, music, and motherhood. During these events, women performed with sistrums, metal rattles used to call forth the divine, and moved in carefully choreographed steps. These dances were not for entertainment. They were sacred acts of praise and alignment, meant to ensure the goddess's favor and the fertility of the land. The boundary between art and worship did not exist. Each note, each step, each gesture was considered a bridge to the divine. In rare instances, women were appointed to the role of God's wife of Ammonius, a highly respected priestess position tied to the cult of Ammonius at Karnak. These women, often daughters or wives of pharaohs, wielded significant religious and political power. They managed large estates, commissioned temple projects, and held titles nearly equal to that of high priests. While these roles were exceptional and deeply tied to royalty, They represent an important truth, that within the spiritual structure of ancient Egypt, female presence was not only accepted but sometimes elevated to a level of reverence. Women also played an essential role in funerary rites, both as mourners and ritual specialists. When a family member passed away, it was the women who prepared the body, sang lamentations, and guided the deceased soul into the afterlife through ritual weeping and wailing. Professional mourners, often women, were hired to lead these ceremonies, imitating the goddesses Isis and Nephthys, who had mourned the death of Osiris. These rituals were not just expressions of grief, they were performances of cosmic importance, believed to protect the dead and ensure a safe passage to the next world. At home, women kept the memory of their ancestors alive through small offerings, prayers, and the retelling of stories. Ancestor veneration was the key aspect of Egyptian spirituality, and women often maintained the ritual responsibilities of remembering birthdays, preparing offerings, and teaching children about their family's lineage and spiritual legacy. Despite these many spiritual roles, women were still excluded from certain aspects of formal priesthood, particularly the performance of sacrificial rites and temple administration, which remained the domain of men. However, within their allowed spaces, households, processions, funerary ceremonies, and musical service, women shaped the spiritual identity of their society. Their rituals may not have been chronicled in state archives, but they were passed from mother to daughter, woven into song, memory, and instinct. Spirituality offered women both solace and structure. It allowed them to connect with forces larger than themselves, to frame their suffering within divine narratives, and to find meaning in repetition. When illness came, they lit lamps. When children were born, they offered thanks. When death approached, they wept and prayed. In every moment, large or small, there was ritual, and in every ritual, there was a woman's hand guiding the flame. The spiritual lives of ancient Egyptian women were not performed on grand stages. They were lived quietly, beneath reed roofs, beside hearth fires, in shadowed corners of bustling temples. And though their voices were seldom recorded, they echoed through generations, ensuring that the divine was never far from the daily life of the people. Long before the grandeur of Egypt was carved into temple walls or painted in vivid tomb murals, it was woven quietly into linen, kneaded into bread, and molded into clay by the hands of women. Their contributions to art, craft, and cultural continuity were not always signed or remembered by name, yet they permeated every aspect of daily life. In ancient Egypt, where continuity and tradition were prized above all else, women played a crucial role not just in maintaining households, but in preserving the aesthetic, practical, and spiritual traditions of an entire civilization. Among the most important materials in ancient Egyptian life was linen, a fabric derived from the flax plant, which grew abundantly along the fertile edges of the Nile. Flax was harvested during the cooler months and required an immense amount of work to become usable thread. While men sometimes participated in the planting and initial harvest, the labor of transforming flax into linen fell largely to women. They soaked the plants to loosen the fibers, dried them, beat them with wooden tools to soften and separate the threads, and finally spun the fibers into long, even strands using simple spindles and distaffs. The spinning was a meditative act, repeated day after day, often accompanied by the quiet hum of song or conversation. Young girls learned the rhythm early, how to keep the threads even, how to untangle a stubborn knot, how to work for hours without breaking concentration. Once the thread was spun, it was woven into cloth using horizontal or vertical looms, most of which were kept in or near the home. Women managed these looms with practiced ease, creating the linen garments worn by virtually every Egyptian, from peasant to pharaoh. Linen was more than a commodity. It carried religious and cultural meaning. Priests wore robes made from the finest, whitest linen to reflect ritual purity. Mummies were wrapped in carefully prepared strips, each piece placed with care to guide the deceased into the afterlife. Everyday clothing, shrouds for burial, trade goods, and temple offerings all relied on the work of women whose names were never etched into tomb walls but whose threads wove through every layer of Egyptian society. Beyond textiles, women contributed to craft production in numerous ways. They were potters, shaping vessels for cooking, storing grain, or carrying water. They molded figurines used in household shrines or as toys for children. Some women specialized in making cosmetics, grinding malachite for eye paint, blending oils and herbs into perfumed ointments, or crafting coal sticks from wood or ivory. These items were sold in local markets or traded with neighbors, creating small but vital networks of commerce and community. In cities and towns, artisan women sometimes formed part of workshops attached to temples or noble households. Here, they might work alongside other women or under the supervision of a senior matron, producing high-quality textiles, jewelry, or ceremonial items. Though these roles were more common among women of lower or middle status, those not born into wealthy homes, they provided a degree of economic participation and professional identity. For some, especially widows or unmarried women, craftwork was a means of survival, independence, and even pride. Storytelling and oral tradition were another realm where women left their mark. In homes where literacy was rare, especially among the lower classes, knowledge and memory were preserved through spoken word. Women told stories to children during chores or at nightfall, myths of gods and goddesses, fables with lessons about loyalty, patience, or caution, and family histories that traced lineages and shared values. These stories were not idle amusements. They were tools of education and moral instruction. In their repetition, they shaped character, reinforced cultural values, and passed wisdom across generations. Women were also responsible for preserving ritual knowledge. They memorized prayers and songs, knew which herbs to burn during seasonal changes, and kept track of important dates for festivals or family observances. In households that could not afford temple participation, women kept the spiritual calendar alive. They marked the passing of ancestors, the return of the flood, and the changing of the moon with offerings and quiet rites. In doing so, they ensured that tradition did not fade, even in the most modest of homes. In elite circles, women also left cultural legacies through the commissioning of art and architecture. Some noble women, particularly those of royal or priestly lineage, directed the decoration of tombs, oversaw the construction of family chapels, or sponsored the copying of religious texts. These women had access to scribes, artists, and resources, and their influence can be seen in the detailed scenes of domestic life that appear on tomb walls, scenes that scholars now study to understand the intricacies of ancient Egyptian home life, many of which centered around women's activities. But perhaps the greatest legacy left by women was their ability to adapt, innovate, and teach. In an environment where tools were basic and resources sometimes scarce, women learned to make do with what they had. They reused, repurposed, repaired. A broken pot became a scoop. A worn tunic was patched into usefulness. Their ingenuity ensured survival, and their careful instruction ensured that each generation entered adulthood with the knowledge they needed to continue. Grand monuments still stand in the desert, testifying to kings and conquerors. But the civilization that made those monuments possible, the one that produced food, clothing, medicine, and continuity, was upheld by women working in shaded courtyards, weaving under the hum of insects, singing lullabies over clay jars, and stirring pots with one arm while cradling a child with the other. Their work was not loud, but it was lasting. The linen they wove clothed the nation. The stories they told preserved its soul, and the rituals they remembered kept its spirit alive. In every thread, every pot, every song, and every quiet act of care, women wove themselves into the very heart of Egyptian identity. Their hands, though rarely celebrated, shaped the very rhythm of life, and in doing so, they passed forward not just the tools of living, but the essence of what it meant to be Egyptian. In ancient Egypt, as in all civilizations, death was a constant presence, its shadow stretching across every threshold, every field, and every family. For women, the passing of a husband marked not only the loss of a partner but the unraveling of stability, identity, and daily routine. Widowhood was not merely a time of grief, it was a test of endurance, resourcefulness, and quiet strength. In a society that prized order and lineage, a widow stood at a precarious crossroads, both respected for her past and uncertain of her future. Marriage had given her a place within her community, a defined role, and often a measure of protection. But when her husband passed, whether from illness, accident, or age, that role shifted. The home remained hers in practice, but its foundation felt suddenly unstable. If she had sons, especially grown ones, her status could remain relatively secure. They might provide support, speak on her behalf in the community, and ensure she remained part of the family's daily life. But if her children were young, or if she had none at all, her position was far more vulnerable. The burial of a husband was a solemn affair. In wealthier households, it involved formal funerary rites, the preparation of the body by embalmers, the recitation of prayers by priests, and the inclusion of offerings, amulets, and shabby figures meant to serve the deceased in the afterlife. The widow often took part in mourning rituals, joining female relatives and hired lamenters who sang dirges, wept openly, and reenacted the divine mourning of Isis and Nephthys over Osiris. These expressions of grief were deeply symbolic, acts of love and cosmic order. They served not only to honor the dead but to reinforce the widow's dignity and place within a sacred tradition. But not all families could afford elaborate funerals. In modest homes, burials were simpler, perhaps just a shroud, a few personal items, and a prayer offered at sunset. And yet, the widow's grief was no less profound. Her days, once structured around shared labor and companionship, were now filled with silence. The tasks continued, bread still had to be baked, children fed, altars tended, but everything felt slightly off balance, like a loom missing a thread or a song with one note too low. Financial hardship often followed. If her husband had worked in a state-supported trade, like temple service or tomb construction, his wages ceased immediately. Land, tools, or livestock might revert to the husband's family or be claimed by creditors. Widows who had no inheritance, or whose dowries were absorbed into the household had few legal protections unless a will had been drawn or property legally recorded in their name. Some returned to their birth families, others depended on sons or brothers. Those without such connections often turned to the community for support, selling bread, linen, perfume, or pottery to earn a modest income. Remarriage was a possibility, particularly for younger widows, and it was not considered shameful. A woman might be taken in by her deceased husband's brother or cousin, ensuring continuity for children and property. But remarriage was not guaranteed, and it often depended on beauty, fertility, and perceived virtue. Older widows were less likely to remarry, instead taking on roles of service within extended families, raising grandchildren, overseeing younger women, or helping with household rituals. Despite the challenges, widowhood could also offer a kind of quiet autonomy. A woman who had managed a household, raised children, and buried her husband had proven herself capable. In some cases, widows became informal leaders within their communities, sources of wisdom and experience, called upon during births, illnesses, or disputes. Some even managed small businesses or inherited land, especially if their sons were too young to take over. Though still constrained by societal norms, these women carved out lives defined by resilience and adaptation. Emotionally, grief took many forms. Some widows became withdrawn, speaking little and keeping to routine. Others found comfort in ritual, maintaining the family altar, making offerings in their husband's name, or visiting his tomb with bread and flowers. Some recorded his memory in brief inscriptions or asked a local scribe to carve his name on a stela. These acts of remembrance were not only for the dead, they were for the living, a way to keep love and connection present even after separation. Culturally, widows were portrayed with a mixture of sympathy and reverence. In songs and tales, the loyal widow was a figure of grace and fortitude, faithful to her husband, tireless in her labor, devoted to her children. But there were also cautionary stories of widows who squandered wealth, behaved improperly, or challenged the norms of their community. These tales served as warnings, shaping behavior through subtle pressure and reinforcing the delicate balance widows had to maintain. And yet, for all the expectations placed upon her, the widow remained human. She missed the small things: her husband's laughter, the sound of his steps returning from the fields, the way he mumbled in his sleep or carved lines into wood when he was thinking. These were not the grand tales recorded in temple scrolls or carved into stone, but they were real. And they were hers. In time, grief softened. The widow adapted. New routines took root. A grandchild's laugh or a neighbor's visit brought light to long afternoons. The burdens remained, but so did a quiet strength, a strength shaped by love, loss, and endurance. In ancient Egypt, where death was seen not as an end but a transition, widows kept the memory of their husbands alive in the most human of ways, by continuing. By rising each day to light the fire, sweep the floor, braid the hair of a child. By whispering his name during offerings. By telling stories he once told. Through these acts, she honored not only his life, but the love they shared and the world they built together. As the sun sank behind the date palms and the long shadows stretched across fields of barley and reeds, the day ended much as it had begun, under the care of women. Though their names are mostly absent from temple walls and royal decrees, the women of ancient Egypt were the unseen architects of a civilization that lasted for thousands of years. Their stories, rarely recorded in hieroglyphs or preserved in grand tombs, are instead etched into the rhythms of daily life, into the breath of children they raised, the bread they baked, and the linen they wove. Their legacy is one of quiet power, deep, resilient, and enduring. From birth to old age, a woman's life was defined by work, faith, family, and expectation. She was a daughter before she could speak, a worker before she could read, a bride before she had finished growing, and a mother before she knew her own strength. Yet within these roles she carved meaning. She passed on traditions, sustained communities, and held families together in times of hardship and joy alike. The average Egyptian woman did not live in the opulent courts of pharaohs or walk among the papyrus scrolls of scribes. She lived in sun-baked villages and crowded towns, her feet dusty from the fields, her hands calloused from labor. Her days began in darkness and ended under flickering oil lamps. She worked not for recognition, but because survival demanded it. And in her work, she found moments of dignity, teaching a daughter how to braid hair, singing while weaving linen, comforting a crying child, whispering prayers over a family meal. Her understanding of the world was practical and spiritual at once. She saw the divine not just in temples, but in the fertility of soil, the rising of the Nile, the health of her children, and the symbols etched onto her household amulets. She honored the gods through action, baking bread, sweeping thresholds, offering incense, and maintaining the harmony of her home. In doing so, she became a quiet priestess of daily life, preserving cosmic order one task at a time. Even in the face of immense physical tolls, childbirth, illness, widowhood, and poverty she endured. Her pain was rarely recorded, but it was real. The grinding of grain wore her bones, the heat of the hearth blackened her skin, the weight of duty bent her shoulders. And still, she rose each day. She did what needed to be done, not for glory, but for the survival of her family and the continuation of a way of life passed down for generations. And in moments when life permitted it, she found joy. In the laughter of children, the fragrance of lotus oil, the rhythm of drums during festivals, the sharing of gossip at the market, the calm of evening prayer. These small joys stitched themselves between hardship like threads of gold through plain linen. They did not erase suffering, but they made life bearable, sometimes even beautiful. Though ancient Egyptian society was deeply structured and patriarchal, women found ways to exert influence within their sphere. They made decisions, formed networks of support, kept oral histories alive, and taught values through example. Older women, especially, carried great respect. Their knowledge was sought, their voices heard in household matters, their presence woven into the identity of the family. In them, tradition lived and breathed. They were not only survivors, they were transmitters of memory, the ones who ensured that the past would not be forgotten. Even without formal education, women became wise. They understood the movement of seasons, the signs of illness, the needs of children, the dangers of weather, the nuances of human emotion. Their wisdom was not found in scrolls, but in stories, instincts, and inherited rituals. They knew when to sow and when to rest, when to comfort and when to correct, when to speak and when to remain silent. Though few women were honored with statues or stele, their impact is visible in the most fundamental aspects of ancient Egyptian life. In the continuity of language, the preservation of religious rites, the constancy of domestic culture, these are their monuments. They built not with stone, but with rhythm and routine. They did not write epics, but they told stories that shaped generations. Their hands are absent from royal signatures, but present in every layer of Egyptian society, from the harvest to the hearth. As we now look back through time, excavating fragments of their world, we find glimpses of these women, in painted tomb scenes, in broken tools, in preserved linens, and in the quiet spaces of everyday objects. Each one speaks of a life once lived, of someone who laughed, cried, hoped, and worked, someone who mattered. The difficult life of a woman in ancient Egypt was defined not by grand achievements, but by endurance. By the ability to face each day, meet its challenges, and carry its burdens with dignity. It was a life lived mostly in silence, but not without meaning. A life of devotion, repetition, and strength that outlasted dynasties and empires. And so, as the lamps dim and the stars rise over the quiet Nile, we remember them, not just as shadows in history, but as the very foundation of it. They were the heartbeat of the home, the caretakers of culture, the unseen architects of one of the most remarkable civilizations the world has ever known. To the ancient Egyptians, death was never truly an end, it was a transition, a crossing from one world into the next. The afterlife was not shrouded in dread or despair, but seen as a continuation of life, renewed in beauty and free of hardship. Yet even in death, the experience of a woman was shaped by the same forces that defined her life: status, family, duty, and faith. For a woman who had endured a life of labor, motherhood, and silent strength, the hope of peace beyond death was a comfort as profound as the Nile's seasonal return. In the final years of her life, a woman's pace might have slowed, her hair silvered, her joints worn by time. She no longer rose before dawn to grind grain or carry water, but she remained the heart of her home, offering wisdom to daughters, stories to grandchildren, and quiet prayers to the gods. Her presence was a reminder of continuity, a living link to ancestors and traditions. In her movements, her words, and her rituals, she carried centuries of inherited knowledge. She was not merely a woman, she was the memory of all the women who had come before. But time moved on, as it always does. Illness might settle in the body slowly, aching limbs, short breath, a quiet fatigue, or arrive swiftly, like a summer storm. In either case, the household would gather. Daughters prepared the bed, swept the floor, lit the oil lamp near the family shrine. Sons consulted priests or local healers. A favorite necklace might be placed nearby, or an amulet tucked beneath the pillow. As the end neared, the home would fall into a hush, broken only by the soft sounds of whispered prayers or the footsteps of family moving gently through the space. When the woman's breath finally stilled, a different kind of work began, a sacred labor that reflected Egypt's deep reverence for death and its rituals. In wealthier families, preparations were handled by professional embalmers. These specialists, trained in the rituals of mummification, washed the body, anointed it with oils, and wrapped it in layer upon layer of linen. Each fold was accompanied by a prayer, a spell, or a gesture meant to protect the deceased on her journey through the Duat, the mysterious realm between life and eternity. Charms and amulets were placed within the wrappings, the Eye of Horus for protection, a scarab for transformation, a jed pillar for stability. For ordinary families, the process was simpler but no less reverent. The body was washed and wrapped in fresh linen. Herbs might be scattered inside the burial shroud, both for fragrance and spiritual power. A cone of scented fat might be placed atop the head, melting slowly in the heat, releasing aroma as the final rites were performed. Women gathered to sing mourning songs, their voices rising and falling like the wind through reeds. These chants were part lament, part invocation, calling on Isis and Nephthys, who had mourned the death of Osiris, to receive the soul of the departed with kindness. The funeral procession was a communal act. The body, laid on a bier or in a simple coffin, was carried through the village or town, followed by mourners, priests, and family. Women often led these processions, their faces veiled in linen, their hands raised in gestures of sorrow. Their presence was not performative, it was essential. Their wailing, their chants, their tears were considered powerful, even necessary, to guide the spirit toward the afterlife and show the gods that this soul had been deeply loved. At the burial site, whether a tomb carved into rock or a grave in the desert sand, rituals were performed to open the path between worlds. In formal ceremonies, priests recited the opening of the mouth ritual, a sacred rite meant to restore the deceased's ability to speak, eat, and breathe in the afterlife. The coffin was laid to rest with care, surrounded by offerings, loaves of bread, jars of beer, pots of honey, baskets of onions and dates. A small statue might represent the woman's ideal self, young, serene, dressed in fine linen. In these moments, the boundary between past and future dissolved. But the rituals did not end at burial. In the days and weeks to come, the woman's family would return to her tomb or grave with offerings. On specific days in the lunar calendar, they brought food, flowers, water, and incense. Her name was spoken aloud, her memory invoked during meals, her presence felt in dreams. In many homes, a small stela was erected with her image, a painted relief showing her seated before an offering table, receiving gifts from the living. These images were not decorative, they were believed to sustain her soul in the next world. In the Duat, according to belief, the woman faced trials and tests. Her heart would be weighed against the feather of Ma'at, the symbol of truth and balance. If her life had been lived with honesty and care, her heart would be light, and she would pass unharmed into the field of reeds, a perfect mirror of Egypt, where the Nile flowed endlessly, crops grew without labor, and families were reunited in joy. If her heart was heavy with wrongdoing, it would be devoured by the fearsome Mammoth, and her soul would vanish forever. For most, however, the field of reeds was not seen as a reward for greatness. It was the natural hope of a life lived in accordance with values. Women, especially, believed in this promise. They had borne life, preserved households, comforted the sick, and honored the gods. Their reward would be eternal rest, surrounded by the warmth of family, free from pain and toil. In this place she would walk beside her ancestors, greet her husband with open arms, and watch her children from afar. The afterlife was not only a destination, it was a continuation of identity. The woman would still be herself, not a spirit lost in the ether, but a recognizable, beloved presence. She might be depicted holding a sistrum, walking through fields of wheat, or sitting beneath a sycamore tree beside a cool stream. These images, painted on tomb walls and carved into coffins, were not fantasy. They were prayers, hopes, and beliefs, spoken through the brush and chisel of those who loved her. Back in the world of the living, her absence was felt deeply. Her place at the hearth, once so steady, was now empty. Her hands, once always in motion, were still. Yet her influence lingered. Her recipes lived in the hands of her daughters. Her stories echoed in the voices of grandchildren. Her woven baskets, her painted pots, her folded linens, each bore her silent imprint. She was gone, and yet she remained. In time, a granddaughter might light a lamp and whisper her name during a household ritual. A neighbor might speak of her kindness. A young mother, tired and overwhelmed, might remember her advice and feel strengthened by it. In these moments, the woman lived on, not only in the afterlife, but in memory, in tradition, in the heartbeat of culture. The journey of a woman in ancient Egypt was not marked by fanfare or monuments, but by the unbroken thread of devotion. Her life was hard, yes, but it was also filled with meaning. Her death was mourned, yes, but also honored. And her spirit, believed to live on, was cherished not for the power she held, but for the love she gave and the lives she touched. Behind the veils of daily labor, beneath the layers of linen and ritual, there existed another world, quiet, mostly unseen, yet essential. It was a world made not of monuments or mandates, but of laughter, whispered advice, shared burdens, and silent understanding. While much of a woman's life in ancient Egypt was centered on family, marriage, and motherhood, another thread wove steadily through her days: the companionship of other women. Whether forged by kinship or circumstance, the social bonds between women offered strength, comfort, and continuity in a world that demanded so much of them. The demands of Egyptian womanhood were unrelenting, but they were rarely endured in solitude. In rural villages, homes sat close together, their walls sharing not only physical support but the sounds of voices, babies crying, pots clinking, and the rhythm of work. Women labored side by side, grinding grain, weaving cloth, washing clothes in the river, and in the space between these tasks, a rich social life emerged. It was in these moments that friendships were formed. Not dramatic or ceremonial, but steady and enduring, grounded in repetition and shared experience. Young girls often formed their first friendships with neighbors or cousins. They played together in the shadows of reed huts, watched the elders work, and slowly began to participate in daily chores. These early bonds, formed while chasing ducks or braiding each other's hair, carried forward into adulthood. As they grew older and entered marriage, their relationships evolved but did not vanish. Letters discovered from the New Kingdom period show women writing to one another, exchanging blessings, gossip, and household advice. These fragments, rare but rich, offer a glimpse into a network of emotional support far more complex than once assumed. In households where extended families lived under one roof, sisterhood was both literal and symbolic. Sisters grew up learning from one another, watching how to care for younger siblings, manage tasks, and navigate the moods of their parents. When one sister married, the bond might strain under distance or changing roles, but it rarely broke. Sisters visited when possible, helped one another through births, and offered refuge during hard times. For women without blood sisters, female cousins or childhood friends often filled that role. Even co-wives, women who shared a husband, particularly in elite or extended households, could form alliances rather than rivalry. Though such arrangements were undoubtedly complicated, not every relationship was marked by jealousy. Some women banded together to manage the household, support one another during pregnancies, or raise children collectively. Shared motherhood became a unifying experience, creating moments of cooperation amidst potential tension. Motherhood itself was a powerful bridge between women. From the moment a woman suspected she might be pregnant, she turned to other women. Mothers, aunts, neighbors, midwives. They shared remedies for morning sickness, stories of past births, and warnings of what signs to watch for. When labor began, it was women who gathered. They bathed her, held her, encouraged her, and stayed until the child was born. Afterward, they helped her bathe, prepared food, and offered prayers for the baby's health. This intimate circle of care created lasting bonds, born not of choice, but of necessity and shared humanity. Friendships also extended into shared rituals and celebrations. Festivals, though religious in origin, were also social events. Women gathered to sing, dance, eat, and offer thanks to deities like Hathor, goddess of love, joy, and music. These celebrations provided rare moments of public expression. Women wore their best linen, braided their hair in elaborate styles, adorned themselves with jewelry, and swayed to the sound of sistrums. In these brief interludes, joy was not only permitted, it was sacred. Laughter became an offering, and sisterhood a form of devotion. Even in mourning, women leaned on one another. When a husband died, it was the women of the community who arrived first. They helped prepare the body, tended the widow, and sang the mourning songs. They stayed through the funeral, shared stories of the deceased, and ensured the widow was not left alone in the empty days that followed. These acts were not formal obligations. They were the natural expressions of a network that had always been there, invisible but indispensable. In illness, too, women became each other's caretakers. They brewed herbal teas, cleaned wounds, massaged aching limbs, and offered the comfort of presence. Sometimes healing came from knowledge passed down, how to treat a fever with crushed herbs, how to ease childbirth pains with warmed stones, but often it came simply from being there. A hand on the shoulder, a bowl of broth, a prayer spoken together. These small gestures carried a kind of magic, the magic of empathy, of having someone nearby who understood. There were also moments of emotional confession, though rarely recorded in history. A woman might share her fears about a difficult husband, her sorrow over a lost child, or her frustration with daily burdens. These conversations happened while folding laundry, braiding hair, or scrubbing floors. The responses weren't grand proclamations, just nods, murmured affirmations, the gentle grip of a hand. And in these moments, women felt seen. Not by scribes or kings, but by one another. Jealousies and tensions existed too, of course. Disagreements over gossip, competition between families, or envy over perceived favor could spark conflict. But in most communities, cooperation outweighed division. The shared challenges of survival, crop failures, flooding, illness, reminded women that solidarity was a form of strength. And so, disputes were often resolved with quiet conversations, mediated by elder women or softened over shared meals. Friendship extended across generations. Elder women acted as guides and mentors. They advised young brides, taught girls how to manage a household, and reminded everyone of family history. Their presence was a constant source of reassurance, and their absence, when they passed, left a gap that no ceremony could fully close. But even in their passing, the lessons remained, echoed in how younger women folded bread, recited prayers, or soothed a crying child. These interwoven relationships formed an invisible safety net. In a society where women's rights were limited by class, custom, and gender roles, emotional support became a source of agency. Through friendship and sisterhood, women found the courage to speak, the space to grieve, and the strength to endure. They became each other's witnesses, testifying not in courts, but in kitchens and courtyards, to the full complexity of life as a woman in ancient Egypt. Though few formal records exist of these relationships, they are written between the lines of history, in the shared tools, the matching amulets, the communal shrines, and the continuity of tradition. These bonds were not temporary comforts. They were the lifeblood of the community, the echo of a kind word, the shared glance that said, "You are not alone." As the Nile flowed steadily past their homes, and time wore down the edges of clay and stone, the friendships of Egyptian women remained. Not loud, not celebrated, but steady, healing, and true. Beneath the shifting sands of time, buried under centuries of stone, salt, and silence, the lives of countless women remain hidden. While the names of kings endure in carved hieroglyphs and royal tombs, most women who sustained ancient Egypt, through labor, love, and quiet perseverance, left no such legacy in writing. Their memory is found instead in traces: a worn comb, a faded wall painting, a prayer inscribed in a forgotten hand. Their voices may be faint, but they are still there, echoing gently through history, waiting to be heard. The narrative of history has long focused on power, rulers, wars, construction, and conquest. But the foundation of any civilization rests not in its monuments, but in the ordinary people who upheld it through daily action. For ancient Egypt, that foundation was largely built by women, by their routines, their rituals, their patience, and their strength. And yet, for centuries, their stories were rarely told. They were not scribed into scrolls, not recorded in annals of government, not heralded in song. Theirs was a legacy written in private spaces, in the unseen hours of morning and twilight. Modern archaeology has begun to illuminate these hidden lives. In towns like Deir el-Medina, researchers have uncovered fragments of letters and household items that offer glimpses into the world of women, instructions on managing food stores, affectionate notes to family, lists of materials for weaving and sewing. In grave sites, offerings once thought to be trivial, a child's toy, a painted mirror, a bundle of linen, are now recognized as profound markers of identity and love. These artifacts whisper stories of motherhood, friendship, spirituality, and endurance. But even with these findings, much remains lost. Most ancient Egyptian women never saw their names etched into stone. They were not pharaohs, queens, or priestesses. They were farmers' wives, potters, basket makers, midwives, weavers, mothers. They lived and died in humble homes, worked under the sun, aged quietly, and were buried in unmarked graves. Yet, in every era, they formed the heartbeat of the culture. To reclaim their stories is to reimagine what history truly means. It is to shift our gaze from the towering temples to the earthen stoves, from the royal tombs to the household altars, from the names carved in granite to the songs sung while grinding grain. It is to recognize that history is not only shaped by those in power, but by those who endure. The women of ancient Egypt endured much. Poverty, illness, childbirth, grief, hunger, flood, and drought. They endured restrictive customs, physical toil, and often a lack of recognition. And yet they did not disappear into despair. They created joy, beauty, and meaning where they could. In the embroidery of linen, the sharing of a fig, the careful recitation of a bedtime tale, they passed on life itself. And what of their dreams? Surely they dreamed, not only of the afterlife, but of peace in the present, of watching their children grow without hardship, of relief from pain, of moments to rest, of being seen, perhaps, not only as a mother or wife, but as a person, whole and singular. Though they rarely had the opportunity to write their dreams, their descendants have inherited their resilience. In today's Egypt, and across the world, many women still carry the weight of labor, tradition, and care. But now, their stories are beginning to be told. Through scholarship, art, literature, and education, the lives of ancient women are no longer silent. They are being pieced together with care, given shape and voice, honored for the essential roles they played. To study these women is to listen carefully, to quiet the noise of conquest and spectacle, and tune into the rhythm of daily life. It is to value the hands that stirred pots and braided hair, the minds that remembered healing recipes, the hearts that loved across lifetimes. It is to understand that greatness does not always wear a crown. Sometimes it wears an apron. Sometimes it sings softly while folding linens. Sometimes it stands by the fire, watching the sun rise, ready to begin again. And what they began, we continue. The knowledge passed from mother to daughter, the prayers carried through generations, the stories whispered at dusk, all are threads in the larger tapestry of human history. By remembering them, we remember ourselves. By honoring them, we honor the millions of unseen women who shaped the world with tenderness and grit. So let us walk gently in their memory. Let us recognize their labor not as background noise, but as the melody of life. Let us hold space for their joys, sorrows, and complexities. Let us see them, not as footnotes, but as foundations. Let us speak their names, even when they are lost, with reverence. Because the difficult life of a woman in ancient Egypt was never just about hardship. It was about resilience. It was about continuity. It was about the quiet power of those who carried the world without asking for praise. Their lives may have passed without monuments, but they built a civilization, and they are not forgotten. And now, as the final echoes of ancient Egypt fade softly into silence, may your mind settle like the sands beside the Nile, calm, still, and undisturbed. We've walked together through the quiet lives of women who bore so much, gave endlessly, and asked for little in return. Their strength was not forged in battle or etched in stone, but lived quietly in kitchens, fields, and cradles. In the hush of twilight, their stories continue, gentle, steady, and enduring. If you've enjoyed this peaceful journey through time, feel free to subscribe, but only if it brings you comfort. I'd love to know where and when you're listening tonight. Whether you're drifting to sleep or simply resting your mind, I hope this story has brought you a moment of peace. Now close your eyes, take a deep breath, and let the stillness of the ancient world guide you into rest. You're safe. You're calm. You're exactly where you need to be. Until next time, sleep well.